Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Muffet Investment Views, where we dive deep into economic concepts and their real-world implications. Today, we're looking at a significant financial strategy used by central banks worldwide, quantitative easing, or QE. We'll explore why it was implemented, its effects on the economy, its role in reducing the tax burden, and the complexities it presents, especially with rising inflation. Let's get started. Quantitative easing began as a response to the 2008 financial crisis. Central banks, like the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve, started buying large amounts of government bonds to inject money directly into the financial system. The goal? To lower interest rates, encourage lending, and stimulate economic growth during a period when traditional monetary policy tools had become ineffective. By purchasing these government bonds, central banks added new money to the economy, which helped to keep interest rates low. This made borrowing cheaper for businesses and consumers, leading to increased spending and investment. Simultaneously, this approach aimed to raise asset prices, which could help increase consumer wealth and further stimulate spending. One of the less discussed benefits of QE was the reduction in the government's tax burden. With lower interest rates, the cost of government borrowing decreased. This meant that the government didn't need to raise taxes to cover its debt, effectively leaving more money in the pockets of businesses and consumers. Let's look at QE in detail. QE was done by creating money, which was then used to buy the gilts. The money paid to the sellers of these gilts was credited to their accounts at commercial banks, which in turn resulted in an increase in reserves held at the Bank of England. These reserves are essentially balances held by commercial banks at the central bank, which they can use for various purposes, including settling transactions amongst themselves or with the Bank of England. The Bank of England pays interest for these reserves at a rate it sets for the monetary policy. A key concept to grasp is the relationship between bond prices and interest rates. Simply put, when the price of government bonds, also known as gilts, increases, the interest rate associated with those gilts decreases. Therefore, when the Bank of England purchases these government bonds, their prices go up, which in turn reduces the interest rates that the government needs to pay on them. In the public sector net debt (PSND) calculations, the gilts owned by the BO are accounted for as assets, and the reserves created are liabilities. However, under the current fiscal reporting rules in the UK, when calculating PSND, these reserves are not included as part of the public debt calculations. This is because they are considered technical liabilities of the central bank, not direct liabilities of the government. Key elements of the QE process. Asset Purchase Facility, APF. This special purpose vehicle is used by the Bank of England to buy government bonds. The APF holds these gilts, and any transactions associated with these bonds are managed through this entity. Indemnity and financial flow. The Treasury indemnifies the APF against losses, meaning if there's a financial shortfall from these operations, the government, and thus the taxpayers, covers it. Conversely, profits generated from these activities are returned to the Treasury, helping to offset the government's overall borrowing costs. This indemnity was given by George Osborne when he was Chancellor. The implications of this will become apparent later in this video. The government bonds retained by the Bank of England accrue interest at their designated rates, usually on a semi-annual basis. The interest payments on these bonds are made by the UK government directly to the Bank of England on the predetermined dates specified within the bond agreements. Essentially, this transaction involves the government paying interest to its own central bank. The Bank of England utilizes the received interest payments to cover the interest accrued on bank reserves, which is based on the bank rate. Importantly, any surplus profit generated from these interest payments is channeled back to the Treasury. This reimbursement serves to mitigate the overall net cost of government borrowing by offsetting some of the government's interest payment expenses. Therefore, the profitability of the Asset Purchase Facility, APF, hinges on the comparative rates of the gilts and the bank rate. If the gilt interest rate exceeds the bank rate, the APF realizes a profit. If the gilt interest rate aligns with the bank rate, the operation is cost neutral. If the gilt interest rate falls below the bank rate, the APF incurs a loss, which is covered by an indemnity from the Treasury. In this arrangement, any increase in interest rates effectively transforms the government's debt obligation within the APF into a floating rate debt, heightening exposure to rate increases if inflation escalates. From 2008 to 2021, the bank rate was maintained at a relatively low level, around 0.5%. enabling the APF to generate substantial profits, which were subsequently transferred to the Treasury. This resulted in the overall net reduction in government debt. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. While QE helped avert a deeper economic downturn, it also led to increased asset prices, contributing significantly to wealth inequality. Those who owned stocks or real estate saw their values climb, benefiting wealthier individuals disproportionately and exacerbating economic divides. As we moved into a new decade, the context began to shift. Initially, QE was intended as a short-term measure, but continued economic challenges, like the COVID-19 pandemic, extended its use. Over time, the massive amounts of money pumped into the economy began showing side effects, namely inflation. Inflation rates began to climb, driven not only by prolonged QE but also by disruptions in supply chains and other global events. This inflation has complicated the economic landscape significantly. Higher inflation means the central banks had to raise interest rates to combat rising prices, which directly affects the cost of servicing government debt. The Bank of England raised its interest rates from 0.5% to 5.25%. With the bank rate at 5.25%, the APF is now facing significant losses. These losses are composed of the differential between the bank rate and the interest on the gilts, as well as capital losses due to declining bond values. Estimates suggest that the QE program could potentially result in a net loss of up to £200 billion, illustrating the substantial fiscal implications of these monetary policy operations. The amount of gilts under the asset purchase program is about £830 billion, which amounts roughly about 25% of the government's overall debt. This could mean more of the government budget going towards interest payments rather than public services or new investments. Unrelated to the effect of QE, the UK has issued the highest amount of inflation-linked gilts at 25% among G7 countries. When inflation was low, the cost of servicing the debt was low. However, now that the inflation has increased, the cost of servicing has increased significantly. This suggests that inflation will affect UK's fiscal position much more than other developed countries. The debate now centers around quantitative tightening, or QT, where central banks aim to sell off the assets bought during QE. This would reduce the money supply and hopefully stabilize or lower inflation rates. But it's a delicate balance. Sell too fast, and you might shock the financial system. Too slow, and inflation might dig in deeper. To summarize, QE was a necessary response to unprecedented economic challenges. It boosted growth and kept the economy afloat during critical times, but has introduced new challenges like rising inflation and increased public debt. As we move forward, the journey of managing these outcomes will be crucial for economic stability. That's all for today's deep dive. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to stay updated with more insights into the economy, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon for notifications. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you think QE has impacted our economy? Until next time, keep analyzing and stay curious.